Okay, so just a quick discussion about in-race and in-session fueling. So this is a topic that can be made very complicated, and there's a lot of debate over the science behind it, but it can also be made incredibly straightforward. So just as a general rule, if you ever start to get any gastrointestinal issues, start to get a bit of an upset stomach, by and large, it tends to be down to the fact that you might have whatever's in your stomach is a little bit too concentrated. So a first step would be to follow up with some plain water just to dilute whatever's in your stomach, help break it down and take some of the pressure off your digestive system. One thing to bear in mind though, that there can be other issues at play when it comes to gastrointestinal issues. For instance, a particularly serious issue called hyponatremia, which is basically where your blood sodium levels are too diluted. A lot of the side effects can often appear like dehydration, which is a little bit risky. And so if it's a particularly hot day, etc., just bear in mind that that can be a potential issue. But for the most part, gastrointestinal issues almost always come down to the fact that you perhaps have eaten a fair amount and not diluted what is in your stomach. So just following on from that, basically what happens is whenever you have something solid or semi-solid like a gel, it will sit there in your stomach. And so the analogy that we often use is to think of your digestive system or your stomach as a bit like a colander. So you've got all the little holes in, you put something solid or semi-solid, it's just going to sit there in kind of like a amorphous gelatinous mess. And so you want plenty of fluids to come in to help break that down, help soften it up and pass through those holes. So in a very simple way, that's kind of what's going on with your stomach when you're racing. Now, one other important thing to make sure is that the fluids that are coming on board, you're not just layering carbohydrate on top of carbohydrate. So that fluid needs to be either plain water or a low carbohydrate hydration drink. Because as I say, otherwise, if you're having a sports drink as an example, you're just layering carbs on top of carbs. And one of the effects that can actually have is that if you've got kind of a concentrated mush in your stomach, it can actually draw fluid back into your digestive system and have a bit of a dehydrating effect. So just remember that, guys. Two kind of key things. Firstly, start getting any gastro issues, potentially just think about how much you've eaten. It might be a bit too concentrated, might need to dilute that. And then secondly, when you're trying to dilute that, the food that's in your stomach, make sure that it's either plain water or a low carb hydration drink. Okay, so then when it comes to kind of building yourself a fueling strategy, it really depends on the intensity of the session or the race that you're doing. So firstly, just bear in mind that your body can store enough glycogen, the storage form of glucose, your main source of fuel for a triathlon. It can store enough glycogen in your muscles and your liver for about an hour to an hour and a half's exercise, depending on the level of intensity. And so if we just start at the faster end, so a sprint distance triathlon, generally speaking, you're probably not going to need much in the way of nutrition on a sprint distance triathlon, depending on your level, of course. And with a higher intensity race like that, you do want to stay down at the semi-solid and fluids end of the spectrum, so the gels. I don't tend to use sports drink, I'll talk about that in a second, but yeah, perhaps more gels, following each time up with plain water. And then as you shift into Olympic distance, again, staying more towards the gels and sports drink end of the spectrum. But as you get to a half Ironman and Ironman distance, that's where I recommend to our athletes that they go for more kind of nutrient dense foods, things like energy bars, homemade preferably, and rice cakes, things like that. Because it's at a lower intensity and your digestive system is less hypoxic, which basically means it's starved of oxygen and less efficient, because it's at that lower intensity, you can handle kind of more, generally speaking, handle more nutrient dense foods. And you're going to be taking on board other nutrients just than pure carbohydrate, which is obviously our main focus. But for a long distance triathlon, you do need other stuff. And then there's also an important point about taste fatigue. If you're just pumping really sugary gels all the way through an Ironman or a half Ironman, you then got to use the same stuff on the run, and you can get pretty sick of it. And it's actually quite an important point, because if you're then reluctant to take on gels, you know, you can eat just a few minutes of holding back on the fueling can spell quite a negative effect on your performance. So just remember that key rule though, guys. Anything solid or semi-solid, remember that's that colander situation. Follow it up with plain water or a low carb hydration drink, and do it strategically. So for instance, as you move on to the run, it's going to be more higher intensity, digestive system is going to go more hypoxic. So use those energy gels strategically. So as you're approaching an aid station, hit the gel and then follow it up with 2 cups of plain water. Okay, and you can't go too far wrong with that. And just remember, again, get any gastro issues, plain water. So in terms of brands to use, so I'm using Named Sport for the gels at the moment, and that's because they're quite thin, they're not too viscous. I find that with a lot of energy gels these days, they're quite thick, and particularly if it's not very hot weather, as we generally get in this country, you have to really kind of chew on it, and I just do not find that helpful, and I find it has quite a negative effect on my stomach when it gets there. I'm also using Talk hydration drink. Really what you're looking for in a hydration drink is anything below about a 4% carbohydrate concentration. Anything more than that, and it's just too concentrated. And that kind of brings us on to sports drinks. So I personally don't use them pretty much at all unless I have to, and that's because generally speaking they're too concentrated. They tend to work off a 4 to an 8% carbohydrate concentration, and that's just not optimal for hydration. And if you've got other carbs in your stomach, it's going to have a poor effect on your nutrition as well. Coming back to that carb layering on top of carb scenario that I was talking about earlier. So yeah, generally speaking, I will stick to whatever is in my bottle is focused purely on hydration, so plain water or a low carb hydration drink. And then whatever's in my pockets or in my food box on my bike, that will generally speaking, because I tend to focus on half iron to iron distance, that will be probably nutrient dense, and then I'll have a few gels that I'll consume in certain scenarios. So for instance, if I need some carbohydrate, but you're on a hill, you can't unwrap your rice cakes nicely, etc. You just got a quick banger of a gel, but again, always following that up with plain water immediately afterwards. So there you go, that's pretty much a whistle-stop tour of hydration and fueling. Obviously, you want to prepare a much more detailed strategy for a race, but those are some pretty, hopefully, simple concepts that will steer you away from serious disaster, basically. So remember, okay, anything solid, semi-solid, follow up with plain water or a low-carb hydration drink. Start getting any gastro issues, plain water, help dilute what is ever in your stomach. So there you go, guys. Hopefully that helps.